Good afternoon, people of God. We thank you for coming back to another installment of Position Transitions Lessons on Warfare. I'm thinking this is probably going to be the last installment. I'm not altogether sure, but I'm thinking it is going to be our last installment, at least for warfare at this point. We will probably, certainly, revisit this because it's such a vast subject matter and there's so much to learn. But we're going to end this series, if this is the end, we're going to end this series talking about warfare from the standpoint of who are we really fighting? What are we really fighting? When we speak of warfare, many times we end up talking about forces that come from outside to attack us. We talk about things that are demonic and things that people do to us that we feel they need to defend. But suppose I told you that most of what we call warfare isn't warfare at all. We call it warfare because of our emotional investments. We call it warfare because of our self-images. We call it warfare because it's not fitting into the paradigms of what we view as right and wrong. And so therefore, we end up calling these things warfare. And we end up calling them attacks. And many times, it's not warfare. Warfare has the intention of stealing, killing, and destroying. Warfare has the intention, once it's launched, warfare is about taking over an area that may or may not belong to someone. Warfare is about getting victory and subduing and overcoming in areas that may or may not be areas that you're willing to release. Or should release for that matter. All of these things sort of fall under the category of warfare. But suppose I was to enlighten you today and tell you that many of the battles that you are fighting, you shouldn't fight the way you're fighting them. The warfare that you are fighting right now, many of us, it deals with what we want as opposed to what we should have. We fight what's best for us. We fight what's good for us because it would seem as though what's best for us and what's good for us does not feel good to us. There are things that God is doing and we say it's of the devil. Shame on us. There are times God moves his hand in our favor, or his intention is when his hand moved to be in our favor. But because we feel so out of place with that move, because the move feels so uncomfortable and so unfamiliar, we categorize it as not being God, not being of God. We speak against it and we fight against it. And many times those moves are the moves we need to embrace. I'm going to share a story with you. It's a true story. It happened to me been a couple of years ago. And when I was thinking on this word, that story came back. I may have shared it with you previously in another lesson. I'm not sure. But it bears repeating because there are revelations in this story. There I was employed with a company. And with this company, we used to have to work with certain equipment and we used to have to get certain things off of the floor. And one day I'm on the floor doing my job. I just happened to be in a different area from where I usually stood when I did my job. Surprisingly to me, a young man walked up to me and began to cuss at me, began to say ugly things to me, all because he felt like I was in his spot. Keep in mind, this was of the company. Nobody had a spot assigned. It was wherever you could find an empty place, that's where you went to work. And it just so happened the place that I usually stood, there were other people there and it was crowded. So I just moved down to the next place, not knowing that this young man had decided that this was his spot. So he began to be very upset with me and began to say ugly things. And I'm standing there and I became very, very angry. But thanks be to God, the Spirit of the Lord checked me. He wouldn't let me open my mouth. I found myself standing there wanting to say something so bad, but I couldn't. Now, I wanted to tell him, you don't own any real estate and you're not renting any real estate in here. We all have to go where we have to go, and you don't have a spot. I wanted to go there, but God wouldn't let me say nothing. Told me to hold my peace. So I did. I didn't mind that so much. It was the next thing God told me. After the young man finished saying what he had to say, he walked away. And he went to his friend base and began to tell them how he told me off. So that added insult to injury. You know how we do. We don't want people to think we're scared of them. And we certainly don't want people to think that they can manipulate us. So I'm pretty angry. But I couldn't say anything because God told me not to. But when he did speak, he said to me the oddest thing. He said, I want you to go and apologize to this young man. I was put out. I'm thinking, God, why do I need to be the one to apologize? I haven't done anything wrong. I actually, God, my silence should have been enough, because I could have let him have it. He was wrong. He knew he was wrong. I knew he was wrong. And you knew he was wrong. And yet you're telling me to go apologize to him? But God didn't say anything else. And you know what? Because I love God the way I do, I went looking for the young man. And when I found him, I said to him, can I talk to you for a moment? That was the first thing that stood out to me. Because here I am feeling some kind of way inside. But what came out of my mouth was very compassionate. And I said, can I talk to you for a moment? And he looked at me and he said, what do you want? About what? Okay, this is not helping any. But I already had my mind made up to do what God said. So I opened my mouth and I said to him, I came to apologize to you for being in your spot. I did not know that was your spot, and I didn't mean to offend you. I was just looking for a place to work. The place where I usually park my belongings to do the job, it was crowded. Other people were there. So I just moved there because the spot happened to be empty at the time. I wasn't doing it to take over your spot. So allow me to apologize. And inside, I am, as the young people say, I'm tripping. Because I'm listening to even how it came out. So I have to know this wasn't really me talking. This was God talking, because Shirley wanted to go in. He looked at me, he said, oh, it was just a misunderstanding, and he walked away. But I felt a burden lift off of me. And from that story, I realized something. It is how we handle situations that denote the intensity of the warfare. The minute I apologized, the warfare ended. The minute I apologized, I not only subdued whatever it was that was working with him, but I subdued what wanted to work with me. And many times, we don't understand that the real warfare is the turmoil that's inside us. That night, I would go to a Bible study, and the speaker had no clue of what I'd been through that day. But guess what? The subject of apologies came up. And this is what the teacher taught. She said many times, God would have us apologize to people when we weren't the one wrong. Now my mouth is wide open. She said the reason he does it is to keep peace. Oh my goodness. And she said, the words "I'm sorry" does not always mean I'm wrong. Many times it means I wish this had not happened. That gives you a different take on it, doesn't it? Those are the hardest words to say, especially when you feel like somebody has wronged you. But if you want to squelch the enemy, if you want to shut his mouth, you have to do it God's way. God told me to go and apologize, even though I wasn't wrong. He did it to keep peace. Suppose I would have gone off. Suppose when I realized, or when people came back who told me, I knew he had went and talked to his friends because they were laughing at him. And they came and were taunting him behind his back, saying, why are you in his spot? Emphasizing the his. He didn't have a clue that was going on. But suppose I would have chimed in on that. Look at all the turmoil that I would have caused, let alone what was already introduced. Understand something, a valuable lesson. Understand that just because the enemy throws something out there doesn't mean you have to say ouch. Doesn't mean you have to act like you hit. Because I followed the mandates of God and I apologized to him, it stopped what could have been a very intense situation. It was funny because after it was all over with, I felt no embarrassment. My anger and offense was gone. And then I began to feel compassion and feel pity towards the young man. Did he ever come back and say he was sorry? No. But it doesn't matter because I won that warfare. Not just with making sure that there was peace remained in that situation, but I gained a victory inside me. Something inside me came more under subjection to the will of God. I realized more how to fight and what to use and what weaponry to use. In this situation, I had to use the weaponry of humility and discipline. God said, don't say anything. So I had to be disciplined enough to keep my mouth shut. And then he said, go apologize. So I had to humble myself under his hand enough to obey that. I couldn't avoid it. I couldn't do something to manipulate around it. And I won the victory because I obeyed God. And I put my own feelings under subjection. I was very proud. I remember the scripture said he would make our enemies our footstools. It doesn't mean we have to always go on a rampage. We don't always have to attack. We don't have to always roll our neck, raise our voices. Sometimes it can just be a simple obedience of humility. I hope this helped you. Go back as you go into your situations of warfare. Before you begin attacking, before you begin letting people know, before you begin telling people off, check what's inside you. Perhaps God is going to use you to prove that he can still make enemies footstools and get victory without any offense. God bless you, saints of God. We'll see you next week.